Hello, my name's Dr. Jeremy Tudway. I'm the Clinical Director for Dimensions, and I'm going to talk to you today about the history of how people with learning disabilities were treated in the United Kingdom. There is a theme that comes through this of them and us, that the idea was that people with learning disabilities were somehow fundamentally different and they were treated accordingly. This involves some very distressing and unvaluing language and the notion that people were fundamentally treated differently. According to some scholars, folklore beliefs and general myths suggested that people with learning disabilities were the result of either sexual relationships with non-humans, they were less than human, supernatural forces, or even beasts and animals. Historical texts indicate that some of the vocalizations that were used by people with learning disabilities were interpreted as conversations with the devil or as people speaking in tongues. So people were either condemned or venerated. Historically, the notion is that people with learning disabilities have been considered outside of our civil society in some form or another. They were fundamentally different from us, and therefore it was reasonable to treat them differently. If we think about some of the historical terms that have been used to label people, they included a subhuman organism, subnormal, a menace, an object of unspeakable dread that had to be feared and removed from the company of other human beings, or an object of ridicule. And we see this time and again in literature where people with learning disabilities are portrayed as villainous or as an object to be ridiculed or made fun of. On the other hand, at times they were seen as an object of pity or a holy innocent that was completely devoid of any kind of motivation or any kind of intention to act. Similarly, a diseased organism or as an eternal child, and therefore should be treated accordingly as an eternal child. And some of this comes from the work of David Wolfenberger, who was very influential in changing things, certainly in the US and the UK. Sadly, even professional language didn't help here, and some of the terms that were used to describe people were cretin, which actually comes from cretin, which is a human who's mentally frail, idiot, which is from the Greek term a private person who couldn't interact with anybody else, an imbecile, which comes from the Latin term for a stick or a bacillus, mentally defective, that's fairly obvious, the term that would imply, moron, Mongol as a term to describe people with Down syndrome, moral defective, high grade or low grade, and feeble-minded. All of these were technical professional terms that were used regularly up until the 1970s. And if you look at historical reports, you can still see things like moron or imbecile or high grade and low grade. So if we think about the state and the state's reaction to people with learning disabilities, we have the emergence of fundamental labels being used for people and the rise of the asylums and the large hospitals. We can trace state intervention in learning disability back to Edward I and the Statute of the Prerogatives, and then Edward II, who differentiated between what he called idiots or natural fools and lunatics. And essentially what that allowed the state to do was to split people with mental disorders into those who were unable to reason and therefore could not look after their property, and those who at times when they were unwell could not be trusted to look after their property. And no prizes for guessing that whilst people were unable to look after their property, the state and the crown looked after it, but also took all the profit. And for people with learning disabilities, the state took over the property and obviously took the proceeds and profits from that. The basic test to see whether or not someone had a learning disability or a mental health problem included the individual being able to say their own age, to say their parents' names, and to repeat the days of the week. So not a very sophisticated model at all. In 1601, Queen Elizabeth I introduced legal rights to families or guardians to protect the land of people with learning disabilities and people with mental health problems for the time that the land made money. And that remained the case until the 1800s, where care and control for people with learning disabilities was moved to local parishes that were under the control of the church. And eventually this led to people with learning disabilities being unattached, being seen as a threat to civil society and a burden on the parishes, and they were then moved into what were referred to as the poorhouses. These were institutions run by the state. This coincides with the Industrial Revolution, where increasingly industrial methods were becoming mechanized, and therefore a skilled labor force was required to meet the demands that this new technology had introduced. People with learning disabilities were viewed as unable to learn. As I say, they were seen as eternal children and unable to learn new skills. And as they were unable to learn new skills, they were not considered useful members of society because they couldn't be productive. In turn, this led to them being considered as non-profitable and therefore a financial burden on society. And following on from this, they were sent to workhouses. Workhouses were an extension of the poorhouse, where poverty was punished by people having to do menial work for very, very low wages or no wages at all. And it was next to impossible for people to move out of those institutions. At the same time, we see the rise of the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was strongly rooted in the idea that human beings had not evolved as a result of natural selection, but by perfecting the human beings, and therefore anyone with a learning disability was seen as somehow different and subhuman. Galton gave rise to the idea that the people with learning disabilities were able to reproduce too fast because they were effectively animals, and that again, all the ills in society were as a result of things that were associated with the individual and not linked to societal problems, general health problems, or difficulties with adequate nutrition and support. And it's interesting that Tregold, there's a quote here from Tregold, who was a medical doctor, and he writes here, "The danger lies in the fact that these degenerates mate with healthy members of the community and thereby constantly drag fresh blood into the vortex of disease and lower the general vigor of the nation." Terrible language there, and effectively it shows that Tregold was summing up a great fear that had arisen in society, that somehow people with learning disabilities would infect the whole population and make it something other than a human race, and therefore they were not going to contribute anything to society, but were in fact a menace. We can say that there were two ways that that this effectively played out. The institutions that were built initially attempted to improve the lives of people with learning disabilities through education, but it changed very rapidly as the eugenics movement increased, and these institutions became locked and they became more and more insular. That because people with learning disabilities couldn't be part of society, society needed to be protected from them. And we can see this coming out later on, that in 1929, a government committee established the idea of making institutions self-sufficient colonies. So what that actually meant was that you had very young children, adolescents, young people, people in middle age and older people, all in the same establishment, and that they were made as completely institutionalized. Some had their own farms, they had their own railway stations, and some even had their own fire stations because they had so many people, in many cases upwards on 2,000 people. And it wasn't until 1946 that the term colony was replaced with hospital under the National Health Service Act. If we think a little bit more about the large hospitals, this was really driven by Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin. And Galton believed that survival of the human race required selective breeding to create a more intellectual race and therefore ensure the survival of the human being. That's sometimes referred to as positive eugenics. He also then believed in negative eugenics, which was to reduce the amount of breeding between people who were deemed as less valuable to society. And there are fine examples of this, to the shame of many societies from around the world. In Nazi Germany in the 1930s, this led to the T4 program that resulted in mass poisoning and the killing of people with learning disabilities. Yet again, that's where the term useless eater was first referred to for people with learning disabilities. In some of the Nordic countries, such as Sweden, Denmark, there was compulsory sterilization so that people couldn't reproduce and have babies, and selective immigration in the United States that excluded people who had learning disabilities. In Britain, negative eugenics was put into place by creating the large institutions and effectively sealing people into them so that they couldn't interact with society. As things began to change, we saw the emergence of community care, and the next few slides will begin to show how things really began to change, and it might be a surprise about how recent this is. During the 1950s and 60s, a number of significant things happened that led to people beginning to question about the appropriateness of large institutions, particularly for people with learning disabilities. There were a number of significant scandals where hospital care was found to be really poor. People were living in terrible conditions, run-down buildings without adequate clothing. There was a lack of privacy for people. People slept in large dormitories, and as I say, this mixed very young children with adults and older adults. The emphasis in these institutions was primarily on physical care, so there was little stimulation for people. There was little in the way of structured activities. Attitudes amongst staff was primarily custodial. In other words, it was about restricting people, stopping people's freedoms. And The most famous of these scandals was the report into the Ely Hospital in South Wales, sometimes referred to as the Howe Report in 1969. Around the same time, in the 50s, there were recommendations regarding how mental illness and learning disability were going to be considered within the National Health Service, which paved the way for the Mental Health Act, and the first version of that emerged in 1959. That ended compulsorily certifying people and led to discharge of many people from the long stay institutions. One of the other things that emerged around about that time was the work of Irving Goffman on the total institution and quite how institutions were so bad for people. In 1971, a famous government white paper called Better Services for the Mentally Handicapped was authored and introduced in Britain. Now, bear in mind, this is 1971. It advocated a 50% reduction in hospital places by 1991 and an increase in local authority-based residential and daycare. In other words, this was support moving out of hospitals, out of the realm of health services, and into social care provided by local government arrangements. It also called for an end to custodial methods of care in hospitals and a recommendation for retraining of hospital staff in appropriate ways to work with people with learning disabilities. By 1979, the J report re-emphasised the need for local government-led care, but also actively promoted the idea of a service philosophy based on the principles of normalisation. And the concepts of normalisation were really developed by Wolfsenberger, where it was the utilisation of means or methods which are as culturally normative as possible. In other words, that people were to be offered the opportunity for support where they could develop and learn skills that were as normal as was culturally valued by the cultures that they existed in. And also that that care should be targeted and driven by the idea of maintaining personal behaviours and characteristics which are as culturally normal as possible. Now, this led to some rather punitive behavioural methods where people were not allowed to engage in a number of behaviours of choice or engage in eccentric behaviours, which might have been part of their makeup and part of who they were. So by the 1980s, this was redefined as social role valorisation. And this included reference to the idea of support and defence of valued social roles for people who were at risk of being devalued, and very much introduced the idea of person-centred planning around the idea that the individual needed to be supported to be an individual. So by the 1980s, the UK is beginning to change quite fundamentally in terms of how services for people with learning disabilities had developed. And then the 5 principles of normalisation were adopted by O'Brien and Tyne, and these were really quite significant accomplishments, if you like, that services needed to demonstrate in order to show that the person was being supported in a way that focused on their development, focused on their personal needs, and focused on having an enriched and full life. Wolfsenberger was an absolutely brilliant psychologist, and he wrote extensively after Irving Goffman about the negative roles of institutions, and he came to the UK to help with the development of early local authority adult training centres, were to move people out of the old hospitals and set them up in the opportunity to develop life skills that were valued in their communities. Early investors in this model were those in Birmingham, Leicester, and Richmond in Surrey, where there were large clusters of hospitals. And of course, in Richmond, you had the famous Normansfield Hospital, where John Langdon Down first described Down syndrome. Now, social role valorisation is something where the idea of the valued social role is at the centre of what people need in terms of support. We then get the 5 accomplishments, as I mentioned earlier, and those are a community presence. That means people are in the same neighbourhoods as ordinary citizens. They have choice, and they're supported in making choices about their lives by understanding their situation. They have competence. That's developing competent skills and attributes that decrease their need for dependency on support. They are respected, and language is introduced to promote the perception of people with disabilities as developing citizens. So moving away from the idea of high grade or low grade or imbecile or cretin to people with learning disabilities and with support needs. And then finally, community participation. That is supporting natural relationships with families, neighbours, co-workers. And it is interesting that I think those 5 accomplishments remain at the very heart of positive social support for people with learning disabilities now. The gradual move out of the institutions into the community has been very, very gradual indeed in the UK, and has gathered speed since the 1980s. However, I think we can compare that in the 50s, it was estimated that around 55,000 people with learning disabilities lived in UK hospitals, whereas now there are around about 3,500 who are currently living in hospital. The aim of government strategy is to further reduce this figure so that only people who absolutely need to have hospital care receive that hospital care that is appropriate, is very timely, and that people can get back to living in the community as soon as they possibly can. The key issues that remain are whether or not there is a clear and sufficient set of resources to develop and maintain support for people, and that remains a challenge to the day. The issues of how this is going to be financed, what appropriate housing can be accessed, and whether or not we have sufficient staff to be able to support people. Interestingly, as identified in the 1950s, appropriate and updated training for staff that ensures that those staff who are involved in support for people with learning disabilities is actually what they need to do the job and do the job well. The issue of ongoing involvement of people with learning disabilities in policy planning and changing things so that there is a chance of making those 5 accomplishments and people do feel valued and engaged. And then finally, ensuring that access to support is as easy as possible and doesn't require expert knowledge and doesn't require significant administrative skills that people with learning disabilities might not necessarily have as a result of their cognitive impairments. And that brings me to the end of my summary. Thank you very much for listening.